The child threw the chair before anyone saw it coming. It hit the stone wall with a crack so sharp the guards flinched back. Then the second boy screamed. Not a tantrum scream. Not a child being difficult scream. This was something primal. Raw. The kind of sound that comes from a body that doesn't know how to hold what it's feeling anymore. The third pup dropped to his knees on the marble floor, hands pressed flat against the cold surface, rocking. Back and forth. Back and forth. 3 boys. 7 years old. Sons of the most powerful alpha king in 4 territories. And not one trained handler in that room could get close to them. Valen watched from the corridor. He didn't move. Didn't announce himself. He pressed his back against the stone pillar just outside the doorway and watched 3 small bodies unravel in real time. The air inside that room was thick, coated. Fear had a smell, sharp and metallic, like copper left in the sun. Aggression had a different one. Heavier, animal, something that pressed against the roof of your mouth. And underneath both of those, there was something else. Instability. That was the word Valen's mind landed on. These boys weren't dangerous. They were lost. Handler Broderick, built like a wall, trained for 15 years in alpha child management, stepped toward the kneeling boy. He got within 4 feet before the first pup launched from across the room and slammed into his chest. Broderick went down hard. 2 more handlers surged forward. One caught a thrown ceramic bowl directly to the shoulder. The second slipped on scattered papers and crashed into the side table. Someone shouted. The shouting made everything worse. The second boy's scream pitched higher. The rocking pup began slamming his forehead gently against the floor. Not enough to hurt himself, but enough to feel something solid. Something real. Valen's hand pressed flat against the pillar. His chest hurt. Not from fear. From recognition. He knew that look. He had worn it once, a long time ago, in a different kind of cold room. That particular silence a person builds around themselves when the world feels like it's made of noise and no one thought to ask whether you needed quiet instead. Hi viewers. Have you ever been in a room full of people and still felt completely invisible? Tell me in the comments. The door at the far end of the hall opened with a sound like a thunderclap. King Soren Adebaovas entered. He was the kind of man rooms reorganized themselves around. Tall, dark-eyed, shoulders that held the weight of 4 territories without seeming to notice. He walked the way people walked when they had never once had to wonder whether they belonged somewhere. The handlers straightened immediately. The boys did not calm. Soren's jaw tightened. He crossed to the center of the room and crouched low, meeting the rocking child at eye level. His voice dropped. Low, deliberate, controlled. Nothing. The boy didn't even look up. Soren stayed there for a long moment. Still. Waiting. Something moved across his face. Not panic. Closer to grief, if a king had been allowed to grieve. He rose slowly. His gaze swept the room. Over the fallen handlers. Over the broken chair. Over the second boy still screaming at the ceiling. And then, for one fractured second, his gaze moved toward the corridor. Toward where Valen stood. He didn't see him. No one ever did. That was the point. Valen pulled back slightly and watched through the gap between the door and the frame. The eldest pup had gone still. Not calm. Not peaceful. But still like an animal that had run out of places to go. He sat against the far wall. Chest heaving. Dark eyes glassy and distant. And then, slowly, impossibly, he turned his head, directly toward the doorway, directly toward Valen. His small, exhausted face went blank. He stopped moving. Valen didn't breathe. From deeper inside the hall, behind the curtained alcove near the fireplace, one of the junior handlers leaned toward the senior staff physician and said 6 words quietly enough that he thought no one could hear. Valen heard. Increase the suppression dose tonight. Memory doesn't always arrive in order. Sometimes it comes in textures. The cold of a marble floor. The sound of boots walking away. The particular weight of silence that follows a door being closed from the outside. Valen Okarisen had been inside the stronghold for 4 months. Before that, he had lived on its edges, close enough to matter when it was convenient, far enough to forget when it wasn't. That was the nature of being an Omega in a world built by alphas. You learn to exist quietly. He had learned it young. 11 years old, standing in a hallway much like this one, being told in careful political language that his presence was a complication. That his scent, even suppressed, was a disruption to the hierarchy being carefully maintained around the Triplet Pups. They were newly born then, 3 weeks old. He had cared for them those first weeks. Not officially. Officially he was a secondary attendant, the lowest-ranking member of a care staff that had 17 people on it. But those 3 small boys had latched onto his presence with a quiet, animal certainty that unsettled everyone around them, especially the council. So he was removed, politely, formally, with language that meant nothing and accomplished everything. We appreciate your service. A reassignment has been arranged. Rejection doesn't always come from hatred. Sometimes it's taught. Someone decided an Omega's influence was too soft for future Alpha Kings. Someone decided softness was weakness. Someone made a decision about what these boys needed without ever once asking what they wanted. And the boys grew up without him. Grew up into something that resembled chaos wearing small royal clothing. Valen moved through the East Corridor now, quiet as habit. He had one job in this wing: resupply the linen storage and document any medical notes left by the care staff, which was how he found the vial. It was sitting on the edge of a medication tray, set apart from the others by half an inch. Small, clear glass. A label fixed to it in handwriting that was slightly too hurried to read quickly. He stopped. Read it again. The name on the label was wrong. Not smudged. Not a clerical shorthand he didn't recognize. The name written there, the medication name, did not match the color of the liquid inside the glass. He knew this because he had seen that particular compound before. 3 years ago in a different facility. Used for a different purpose than what this label claimed. His hand hovered over it. He didn't touch it. Not yet. He was already invisible. Touching things that didn't belong to him was a different kind of problem, the kind that stopped being quiet very fast. He memorized the label, every detail. Then he walked. And that night, in the narrow corridor that ran behind the eastern wing, the one that the handlers used for supply access and didn't bother to check, he heard a sound so small that anyone moving at normal speed would have missed it entirely. A single, bitten-off breath. He stopped, pressed against the wall, and looked through the half-open service door into the small side room where the youngest pup, Theron, they called him, though no one used his name with any warmth, was sitting alone in the corner. Not raging, not throwing things, shaking, quietly, deliberately, like someone who had decided that if he kept very still and very small, whatever was happening inside his body might not notice him. Trying not to be seen. Valen recognized that too. The storm hit the stronghold after midnight. It came from the north, the kind that didn't announce itself with wind first but arrived all at once, pressing against the high windows like it had a point to make. Snow thick enough to turn the courtyard lights into blurs. The interior of the eastern wing went very quiet. Handlers rotated to the overnight positions. The medical staff cleared out. The fire in the main corridor burned low, and the stone walls held the cold the way stone always did, without caring. Valen shouldn't have been there. His shift had ended 2 hours ago. He had signed the log, turned in the linen records, walked to the staff quarters, and then turned around, because Theron was still in that side room and no one had gone to check. He moved without making sound, not careful exactly, but deliberate. Each step placed with intention. He reached the service door and pushed it open just wide enough to pass through. The room was dark except for the firelight seeping under the main door. Theron was still in the corner. He wasn't shaking as hard now, but his knees were pulled to his chest and his breathing had that shallow, careful quality. The kind of breathing someone does when they've decided that taking up air is something they need to justify. Valen stopped 3 feet from him. He didn't crouch immediately, didn't reach out, didn't make a sound. He simply existed in the room, waited. 1 minute. Maybe 2. And then, slowly, the patches on his wrist that suppressed his scent gave way under the warmth of the fire. It was small. Just a thread of it. The faintest uncoiling of something that had been compressed for so long it barely remembered what it was. Warm. Like cedar pressed in late summer. Like the inside of something safe. Theron's head came up. He didn't scream. He didn't lash out. His small dark eyes found Valen in the low light and went blank. Not vacant. The other kind. The kind of blank that happens when a body stops bracing for impact because something in it has said, not this one. Sometimes the body recognizes safety before the mind allows it. Theron's shoulders dropped. Just slightly. 1 inch. And then he leaned. Not all the way. Not dramatically. Just a millimeter toward that warmth like a plant that didn't know it was doing it. Valen lowered himself to the floor. Cross-legged. Unhurried. Like this was something he did every night. He pulled a small notepad from his pocket and began to write. Theron watched the pen move. His breathing slowed. After a while, 7 minutes, maybe 8, the main door shifted. Pushed open quietly. The second pup, Rail, the middle one, always the one with the fastest reactions, stood in the doorway in his sleeping clothes. He had clearly been awake. His eyes were red-rimmed and alert and very, very cautious. He looked at his brother. Looked at Valen. Tension moved through his small frame like a current. Ready to surge, ready to fight, ready to take up all the space the room had. Valen didn't move. Didn't look directly at him. Just kept his breathing even. The cedar scent held. Rail's chin dropped slightly. Then he walked across the room and sat on the other side of Valen without saying a word. The three of them sat in the dark. The storm pressed against the windows. From the doorway came no sound. No footsteps. No third pup. The eldest, Cashin, stood just beyond the frame where the firelight didn't reach him. Watching. Not coming in. Just watching. And somewhere down the corridor, a small red light on a wall-mounted security panel blinked on, then held. The camera had turned. Soren watched the footage at 4 in the morning. He had been awake already, he usually was. Sleep was something that happened to other people. He ran on 3 hours and discipline and the particular alertness of a man who had learned early that relaxing fully was something you only did in places you were certain were safe. This stronghold was his. He was not relaxed. He sat at the desk in his private study and watched the security feed on the screen without speaking. No one else was in the room. He had sent the night 8 out 20 minutes ago. What he needed to understand, he needed to understand alone. The footage was 11 minutes long. He watched it twice. He was looking for force. There was none. He was looking for manipulation, the kind that handlers used, the pressure points, the deliberate dominance moves that established hierarchy through controlled fear. The techniques that worked briefly and left the pups worse than before. There was none of that either. What the footage showed was a man sitting on a floor, doing almost nothing, and 3 children, 2 of them anyway, slowly moving into his orbit like planets that had found a sun they didn't know they'd been missing. Power notices what it cannot control. And Soren was very, very good at noticing things. He pulled up the staff records, cross-referenced the security badge log for that corridor, found the name on the overnight access entry. Valen Okarisen, secondary attendant, medical supply division, assigned to the Eastern Wing 4 months ago. He pulled the prior records. Read them again. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. He pressed the intercom. Bring him to me. Not the phrasing he used when someone had done wrong. Different. The aide on the other end paused half a second. Yes, sir. Now. Valen arrived 12 minutes later. He was still in his work clothes. He had not been given time to change. He stood in the doorway of the study with the careful, settled posture of someone who had learned not to make themselves seem smaller when they were nervous, because making yourself smaller didn't actually help. He was not small. Not physically, he was tall, lean, quiet-looking in the way that a room gets quiet right before something shifts. His eyes were still and careful, and they moved across the study the way eyes do when they're cataloging exits. Soren stood, not as a power move, just because sitting felt wrong for whatever this was. They looked at each other across 12 feet of Persian rug and firelight. Soren said nothing for a moment. He was testing something. Proximity. Even at 12 feet, something in the air between them had changed its texture. Not obvious. Not loud. But Soren had spent 31 years in a body trained to read biological signals, and what that body was telling him now made him very carefully keep his expression neutral. He stepped forward. 3 feet. His nostrils flared just slightly. Barely enough for anyone watching to catch. "Why do they come for you?" He asked it the way he asked most things, like a statement wearing a question's shape. Direct. Without room for deflection. Valen looked at him. And didn't speak. Not because he was afraid. Because he couldn't. Started at noon. No warning. No slow build. Just the eldest pup, Cashin. Walking into the main hall and going rigid in the center of the floor like something had seized up in his chest. Then the scream. Then the others. All 3 of them in under 90 seconds. The handlers moved fast. Broderick had a new technique, approved by the medical staff, tested 3 times in controlled environments. He was confident. You could see it in the set of his shoulders. He got within 6 feet of Cashin, and the boy turned on him with a fury that had no ceiling. Broderick went backward into the wall. The second handler used the restraint cloth, a de-escalation tool, technically. It lasted 40 seconds before Rail tore through it with his bare hands and threw it across the room. The third handler tried to create a physical barrier between the pups and the door, and Theron, the smallest one, walked directly through him like he wasn't there. Someone called for the medical staff. Someone else called for the sedatives. Soren was in the room in 4 minutes. He crossed to the center and stood between his sons and the chaos of the handlers, arms out, voice low, every ounce of alpha authority in his body aimed at reaching them. The boys looked at him and kept going. Valen stepped through the side door. He hadn't been called. He had heard it from 2 corridors over and walked toward it the way a person walks toward a sound they already know the answer to. He stopped just inside the doorway. He didn't announce himself. He simply stood. Soren turned. Their eyes met. For a half second, something moved across the king's face. Not anger. Not even surprise. Closer to a question he hadn't finished forming yet. He stepped to the side. Valen walked forward. The suppression patches had been failing for 3 days. He knew it. He had filed for replacements and they had not arrived yet, which was its own problem for a different moment. Right now, the thread of cedar and warmth that his body kept releasing without his permission moved into the room like a slow exhale. Cashin stopped mid-motion. His head came up. Rail went still a half second later. It moved through him like a wave breaking against something solid. And Theron, little Theron, always last, always watching, made a sound that wasn't a word, wasn't a scream. It was the sound of something unwinding. The 3 of them moved, not toward Soren, not toward the handlers, toward Valen. Rail reached him first and pressed into his left side with a force that would have knocked a smaller man sideways. Valen planted his feet and held. Theron reached his right side a second later, both small fists gripping the fabric of Valen's shirt. Cashin stood 2 feet away, didn't close the gap, just looked at him. Something in his dark eyes shifted, recognition, maybe, or the beginning of it. Sometimes protection isn't a decision, it's a reflex. Soren stood very still on the other side of the room. He was watching his sons breathe, watching their shoulders drop, watching the tension move out of their bodies in real time like a tide going out. He was also watching the space around Valen. The instinct hit him before the logic did. It moved through his chest and down his arms and settled in his hands as something territorial and absolute. He turned. One of the handlers was stepping forward. Broderick, still recalibrating, still trying to find his usefulness in the room, moving toward Valen to reassert his position in the process. Soren moved between them. Not quickly, not dramatically, just placed himself there. Between Broderick and Valen, and the 3 boys clustered against this quiet man's sides. Broderick stopped, looked at the king, said nothing. Soren held the space for 3 full seconds. Then he turned back to the room. From below, from the level of knees and fists and small boy sounds, Cashin's hand moved. Slowly, he reached up and curled his fingers into the hem of Valen's shirt. He didn't look up, didn't say anything, just held on. Valen looked down at him. He didn't move, didn't pull away. His hand dropped, careful and unhurried, to rest lightly at the side of Cashin's head. The room was so quiet you could hear the fire. Soren turned to address the room. Handlers, staff, the physician hovering near the door. He said 2 words, plain, final, no room for discussion. He stays. 3 boys who couldn't be reached by anyone. Calmed by a man nobody saw. Was it really just his scent? Or did those children recognize something everyone else had been trained to overlook? Drop your answer below and tell me. Have you ever felt like someone truly saw you before they even spoke a word to you? They moved him before morning. No announcement, no formal request. Just a quiet order passed through 2 staff members and a set of rooms unlocked in the protected inner wing. The part of the stronghold that required a clearance level Valen had never been anywhere near. He stood in the doorway of the new quarters and didn't move for a full 10 seconds. The rooms were warm. That was the first thing. Not the forced warmth of a building that was trying to compensate for stone and winter. Real warmth. The kind that came from a fireplace that had been lit hours earlier, from thick wool draped over the furniture, from windows sealed properly against the cold outside. Soft textures everywhere. Heavy curtains the color of dark water. A rug that swallowed footsteps. A bed with actual weight to it, the kind you could press your hand against and feel pushback. Valen set his bag down on the floor. He didn't unpack it. Not yet. He wasn't sure he trusted that this was real. That was the thing about being given something you had stopped expecting. Your body didn't know how to receive it right away. Kept waiting for the catch. The correction. The politely worded reversal that would explain why this had all been a misunderstanding. No one came. By the second afternoon, Cashin found him. The eldest pup appeared in the corridor outside Valen's door without any of the handlers that were supposed to accompany him everywhere. He stood there in his royal clothing. Slightly crooked, 1 button done wrong, and looked at the door like he was making a decision. Then he knocked. 2 knocks. Very deliberate. Valen opened the door. Cashin looked at him for a long moment, then walked in and sat on the floor by the fireplace like it was something he had done 100 times. Valen sat across from him. The fire moved between them. Safety isn't loud. It's consistent. Rail came the next day. Theron the day after that. Each of them arriving separately, each of them with the same quiet determination. Like they had decided something privately and were each carrying out their part of it. By the 4th day, all 3 of them were in Valen's quarters at the same time. No meltdown. No handlers required. No broken furniture. Just 3 boys and 1 man and a fire that burned steadily through the afternoon. Soren watched from the corridor. He didn't interfere. He stood just far enough back that the angle of the doorframe kept him out of their sight line, and he watched his sons. His 3 impossible, unreachable sons, sitting quietly in a room with a man who hadn't been given a single official reason to be there. His expression was difficult to read. Not cold. Not warm exactly either. Something in between. Something that looked like a man recalculating something he had been certain of for a long time. He stood there for 11 minutes. Then he left. And that night, when the stronghold went quiet and the storm from 3 days ago had finally moved east, Valen felt it before he understood it. The skin along his arms, the back of his neck, the suppression patch on his left wrist had stopped working entirely. He reached for it in the dark, pulled it away from his skin, and the scent that had been compressed for months, that cedar warmth, that deep quiet thing, exhaled into the room all at once. Slow, complete. Like a door being opened from the inside. He made it to the far corner of the room before his legs gave out. Valen sat against the wall with his back pressed to the cold stone, the only cold surface left, and tried to breathe through it. The biological state that had been building under 6 months of suppression patches and controlled schedules had arrived all at once and without courtesy. This was what happened when the body got tired of being managed. It stopped asking permission. Heat crash. That was the clinical term. Not an emergency, technically. Not dangerous, technically. Just a complete system override that made every nerve in your body feel like it had been turned up past the level it was designed to handle. He pressed his palms flat against the floor, focused on the texture, the solidity, tried to make himself very small and very still. Down the corridor, something shifted. He heard it before he could stop himself from hearing it. The soft distress sounds starting from one of the pups' rooms. One, then two. Rael's voice first, higher and more urgent than usual. Then Theron's. They could feel it. That was the problem with this particular biology. When an Omega system crossed certain thresholds, it sent out a signal. Not loud, not intentional, but it moved through the air the same way smoke moved, without asking, without stopping for walls or closed doors. And alpha pups, especially these three, especially now, felt it as distress. Their distress matched his. Then amplified. Valen pushed himself up from the floor. He made it as far as the window. The door opened. He didn't turn around. He knew the footstep. Heavier than the handlers. More deliberate. The particular sound of a man who didn't announce himself because he had never needed to. Soren closed the door behind him. He didn't cross the room immediately. Just stood. And Valen felt the shift. The alpha presence, that gravitational weight that usually made the air feel more pressurized, and waited for it to become something difficult. Didn't. Soren walked to the far side of the room. Put the window between them. Stayed there. Real power isn't taking what you can. It's choosing not to. He didn't reach for Valen. Didn't crowd him. Didn't use the biological leverage that was sitting right there in the air between them, available and obvious and completely unused. He just stood on the other side of the space like a wall, not boxing Valen in, keeping everything else out. The pups' sounds down the corridor quieted after several minutes. Soren's presence was doing something to the room's pressure, evening it out, creating a kind of stability that Valen's compromised biology could read as safe without having to work for it. Valen's breathing slowed. Not all the way, but enough. He didn't turn around. His right hand moved from the window frame. Reached sideways, not consciously. Not as a choice. The way a body moves in the dark when it's stopped consulting the part of you that makes decisions. His fingers found the edge of Soren's sleeve. Didn't grip. Just rested there. The room was completely still. Soren looked down at the hand against his arm. He didn't move. 3 seconds passed. And then, in a voice that had no performance in it, no authority, no distance, he said, "You're safe here." Morning arrived gray and without ceremony. The fire had burned down to coals. The room smelled like cedar and cold stone and something that had settled in the night. Something without a name that sat in the chest like a breath held for too long. Finally let go. Valen woke first. He lay still for a moment before opening his eyes. There was a particular quality to the quiet, not the silence of an empty room. The other kind. The kind that has people in it. He looked. All 3 of them. Cashin was nearest. Seated on the floor with his back against the side of the chair. Knees drawn up. Head dropped forward in sleep. Rael had ended up horizontal on the rug, one arm thrown over his face. Theron was the closest. He had gotten onto the edge of the bed at some point in the night and was curled against Valen's side with both fists still gripping the blanket. All 3 of them. Peaceful. Completely, quietly, deeply asleep. Valen looked at them for a long time. He had known, intellectually, that the boys had been struggling. Anyone could see that. But seeing them like this, soft, unguarded, finally resting, made something else clear. Something harder. They never hated him. Not once. Not ever. They had been surrounded by people making decisions about what was best for them, what kind of influence was appropriate, what hierarchy needed to be maintained, what an Omega's presence said about the strength of future Alpha Kings. And in all of that deciding, no one had asked what the boys felt. They hadn't been rejecting Valen. They had been reacting to everyone who pulled him away. That matters. The door opened slowly from the hallway. Soren stepped inside. He looked at his sons. Stayed there in the doorway for a moment with his hands still on the frame, and something moved through his face. Not quick, not performed. It moved the way grief moves, or its cousin. The slow recognition of having been wrong about something you couldn't take back. He looked at Valen. Valen met his gaze and didn't look away. Soren crossed the room. Sat in the chair that Cashin had been leaning against, carefully so the boy didn't stir. He was quiet for a long moment. "I trusted the council's judgment," he said finally. 4 years ago, when they told me the Omega influence was complicating the development of alpha instincts. He paused. "I thought they were protecting the boys." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The hardest truth isn't betrayal. It's realizing you were wrong. Valen looked at the sleeping boys. The council met at 7 in the morning. That was the first sign something was wrong. The council never met at 7. 7 was for staff briefings and medical rounds and the kind of administrative work that no one important was expected to attend. When the council requested Soren's presence at 7, it meant they had something prepared that they didn't want him to have time to think about. He went anyway. Valen heard about it from the corridor outside the meeting chamber, through the voice of a junior aide who was reporting to someone further down the hall and not being careful enough about the distance his voice carried. The council's position was clear. The Omega was destabilizing the Alpha hierarchy. That was the phrase they were using. Destabilizing. As if 3 boys sleeping through the night for the first time in months was a threat. As if the absence of broken furniture was somehow more dangerous than the presence of it. Valen stood against the wall and let the aide's words pass through him. He had heard this argument before. Different room, different decade, same shape. What they were really saying, what they were always really saying, was that what couldn't be classified couldn't be controlled, and what couldn't be controlled was a liability. Soren came out of the chamber an hour later. His face was unreadable. He walked past the corridor where Valen stood. Did not look at him. Did not stop. Systems don't break loudly. They resist quietly. Later that afternoon, a handler informed Valen that his access to the inner wing would be temporarily suspended, pending a review of care protocols. Temporary. That word had done a lot of work in Valen's life. He returned to the outer staff quarters, sat on the edge of the narrow bed, looked at his hands. Down the hall, in the protected inner wing, Cashin stopped speaking. He had been speaking. Small things, 1 or 2 words, the beginning of something, and then Valen was not there, and Cashin closed his mouth and it stayed closed. Rail stopped eating. Just stopped. Sat in front of the meal trays the handlers brought and looked at them without interest and didn't reach. Theron was the one they found on the floor. Not in crisis. Not throwing things. Just lying flat on the rug in the center of his room. Face turned toward the wall. Completely unresponsive to anything the handlers tried. Not asleep. Just gone somewhere inside himself. The medical staff was called. The medical staff looked at 3 boys in various states of regression and wrote it down and said words like withdrawal and sensitivity threshold and biological dependency and used very careful clinical language to describe what was actually very simple. The youngest pup had stopped responding entirely. Valen was informed in a written note pushed under the door of his outer quarters. He read it. Read it again. Then he stood up, put on his jacket and walked back toward the inner wing. No aide stopped him. Not because no one saw him, because Soren was standing at the end of the corridor, watching him come, and stepping aside. The council chamber had never been used for this. It was built for declarations, for judgments, for the kind of formal occasions where the architecture of the room did as much work as the words spoken inside it. High ceilings, carved stone, a table long enough to seat 20, the king's seat elevated by 2 steps above the rest. Soren stood at the front of it. Not seated. The council members sat below him, which was how it always was. 12 of them, all older than 40. Most of them in the positions they held because someone before them had held those positions, which they had understood to mean permanence. Today they were learning something different. Valen stood near the back of the room. He had not been asked to come to the center. He had not been asked to stand anywhere specific, actually. He had simply been told, in writing by Soren's aide, in a note with no preamble and no explanation, that his presence at the morning session was requested. He came. He stood near the back. And he listened. Soren spoke for 11 minutes. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't use the particular cadence of authority that kings used when they wanted rooms to feel their power. He used a quieter register, careful, direct, the way a person speaks when they have thought through everything they are about to say and are not interested in revision. He presented data, medical records, sleep logs, behavioral assessments from the past 4 years cross-referenced against the past 3 weeks. The numbers were not dramatic. They didn't need to be. 4 years of escalating crisis. 3 weeks of decline. The numbers said everything the room needed to hear. Then he said one more thing. An omega's value is not measured by hierarchy position. It is not determined by whether he serves a system that was designed before he arrived. And it cannot be revoked by people whose primary interest is maintaining a structure that stopped working years ago. Pause. Valen Okarisen will be given formal protected status under this household. Permanent. Non-negotiable. The review is closed. No one spoke. Not because they agreed. Because they understood that the conversation was over. Some people think power is about control. But the truth is, the strongest people are the ones others feel safe enough to become themselves around. Valen stood near the back of the room and looked at the floor. He was not doing what people in stories did in this moment. He was not standing taller, not feeling the righteous weight of vindication settle across his shoulders. He was thinking about Theron on the floor of his room, about Cashin's 2 deliberate knocks on a door, about Rael sitting down without a word and just deciding to stay. He looked up. Soren was looking at him from across the room, not with triumph, not with the expression of a man who had won something, with the expression of a man who had corrected something. And that was different. That night the 3 pups slept. All of them in the same room without a single handler required. The fire burned low. The stronghold settled into the kind of quiet it hadn't held in years. Valen sat in the chair by the window. The cedar warmth of him moved through the room freely now. No patches. No suppression. No apology for existing. He looked out at the dark beyond the glass. The snow still on the ground. The distant lights of the city where the mafia infrastructure that kept this territory running moved through its own rhythms. Complicated. Layered. Full of things that hadn't been resolved. The world past these walls was not fixed. This room was not the whole story. Something arrived on the night courier. A sealed report, delivered to Soren's desk at the far end of the hall. It sat there until morning. And in the morning, when Soren read it, when his expression shifted from still to something else entirely, he set it down and looked at the window for a long moment. The report was 3 pages. The relevant section was 1 paragraph. Another territory had begun running experiments. Not on adults. On Omega children. Valen was given the report at midday. He read it standing in the doorway of the room where the boys were sleeping. He read the whole thing, set it down, and looked at nothing for a very long time. When he finally moved, it wasn't to find Soren. It wasn't to go back to the room or the chair, or the warmth that had finally, after everything, been allowed to stay. He picked up the notepad on the table beside him, wrote 3 words, set the pen down, and the last line, in his own handwriting, in the quiet of a morning that had just changed its shape. This time, I won't stay silent. And there it is. From a man no one saw, to the reason everything changed. These 3 boys didn't need to be fixed. They needed to be found. If the story moved something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it right now. Subscribe and turn on notifications because the next story coming to this channel is the kind that will stop you mid-scroll and make you stay. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever been the person in the room that nobody called, but who changed everything anyway? Your story matters here. Don't miss what's coming next.